Good day. I would like to discuss the application of professional judgment with regards to the extent of documentation on RAC planning working papers for smaller or low-risk entities. We have recently received feedback from some of our clients that are performing audits of small or non-complex entities that some of the working papers recently updated for ISA 315 are quite cumbersome and time-consuming to complete. The arguments we generally hear are, it's a low-risk client, or it's a voluntary audit, or our budget does not cater for the extent of documentation required. The first question that we need to ask ourselves is, but why is it then an audit? If a company or entity chooses to subject itself to an audit, all the ISA standards and requirements apply, and the entity needs to be prepared to pay for a compliant audit. There might be other options, like for instance an independent review, that is more appropriate for such entities. That said, with the major changes that ISA 315 has brought about, and with the still long-awaited standard for less complex entities not yet released, we are in a very uncomfortable position as a provider of template working papers. Draftworx have to provide templates that facilitate the ISA requirements and will, to the best of our ability, ensure that you are able to document sufficient and appropriate audit evidence to support your audit opinion. If we remove anything from the templates because it is time-consuming or inconvenient to complete, and the firm gets an IRBA inspection finding, the blame gets put on us and the quality of our working paper templates are questioned. Nothing in the standards say you can skip this if the client is small. What the standard does say is you can use professional judgment, but it is almost impossible for us to exercise that professional judgment in a template. ISA 315 is intended for audits of all entities, regardless the size or complexity. The application material, and that is the A paragraphs of the statement, incorporates specific scalability considerations which illustrate the application of the requirements to all entities, regardless of whether their nature and circumstances are less or more complex. While the size of an entity may be an indicator of its complexity, some smaller entities may be complex and some larger entities may be less complex. Let's look at an example of how ISA 315 addresses scalability. For instance, paragraph 24 states, the auditor shall obtain an understanding of the entity's process of monitoring the system of internal control relevant to the preparation of the financial statements through performing risk assessment procedures. Then it goes further in the application paragraphs A114 to say that in less complex entities, and in particular owner-manager entities, the auditor's understanding of the entity's process to monitor the system of internal control is often focused on how management or the owner-manager is directly involved in operations, as there may not be any other monitoring activities. Some further guidance in A115 states, for entities where there is no formal process for monitoring the system of internal control, understanding the process to monitor the system may include understanding of periodic reviews of management accounting information that are designed to contribute to how the entity prevents and detects misstatements. You can see that these paragraphs give some additional guidance on what to focus on and which monitoring controls could be in place in smaller entities. However, from a template development point of view, it is impossible for us to determine the specific circumstances or the complexity of the client that you are auditing, and can therefore not tailor a template working paper to fit all entities. We can only provide for the ISA requirements, and each auditor will have to apply their professional judgment to the extent of documentation required by applying the ISA315 Scalability application material provided in the statement that is applicable to your client's circumstances, size, or complexity. The real problem comes in when a first-year trainee is asked to complete the planning of a small entity. They will take, for instance, a week to document the planning because they can't yet apply professional judgment, and in trying to do the best job, they will spend hours on documenting, for instance, the lack of entity-level controls, not realizing that the majority of entity-level controls listed in the working paper are not appropriate in the circumstances or nature of the entity audited. And then the budget is blown. The good news, however, is that we will revisit these working papers once the standard on less complex entities is available to decide how we can incorporate or implement the new requirements into our templates to enhance efficiencies. Today I want to discuss some tips that can help you to complete some working papers more efficiently. Please note, we are not saying anything on the working papers is not applicable. We are merely saying that if you think that there is a better way to document and be compliant, then apply professional judgment. But to let RAC work, there are certain minimum steps that need to be documented, and I will indicate that in the specific working papers. Now just quickly, if we look at section 11 and 12, it is important to complete as much detail as is required for the size and the complexity of the entity. If there are certain sections that is not applicable, you can indicate that and then proceed to the next part of a working paper. The two working papers that I will deal with specifically in section 11 and 12 is working paper 1240 and 1245, which are the entity level controls and IT controls. What is important on these documents is that you document at least the basic entity level and IT general controls and applicable software applications, so that you will be able to conclude on the effectiveness on the entity level and IT controls. Those conclusions on the effectiveness will then pull through to other working papers in the audit approach, and it's very important to document those conclusions. Then the last working paper that I will discuss today is in section 13, the system notes. What is important to note there is that at this point in time, all system notes are being populated in section 13, but you will have to look at 1020 to identify which are the system notes that is actually applicable to your audit, and indicate the others as being not applicable, so that you don't spend any time in trying to complete system notes for cycles where there is no figures on the financial statements. Lastly, in section 10, 15, 16 and 17, those working papers need to be completed in detail, irrespective of the nature or complexity of the entity. Working paper 1240, entity level controls. What is important is we need to realize that most of the controls on this working paper would most probably relate to the financial statement level and not necessarily to the assertion level. We did make provision on the working paper for assertion level risks, but for now, let's just keep in mind that we are looking for controls and for risks that relate to the overall financial statement level. Now, per ISA 315, the understanding that the auditor need to obtain and therefore document relates to the control environment relevant to the preparation of the financial statements, and those requirements are addressed in number 1 to 8 of the working paper. Then the risk assessment process in numbers 9 and 10, and then lastly the process of monitoring the system of internal control, which are addressed in numbers 11 to 25. The documentation requirements relating to working paper 1240 is that the key elements of the understanding that you've obtained on the control environment, the entity's risk assessment process, and monitoring controls need to be documented. Also, the sources of information from which the auditor's understanding was obtained, risk assessment procedures that was performed, which would probably be a walkthrough test. Then also the evaluation and design and implementation of controls, should you decide to perform the walkthrough test, and the identified or assessed risk of material misstatement at financial statement level and at assertion level if applicable. Then lastly, the action step 5 is very important. That is where the overall conclusions about the entity's internal control environment will be documented, and that conclusion, whether the controls are effective or ineffective, will then pull through to working papers 1505 and 1605 later in the audit approach. So when you open the working paper, it would pretty much look the way that you see on your screen at the moment. At the very left, we've listed entity level controls under specific headings like your risk assessment, the monitoring, and just general entity controls. Please keep in mind that the entity level controls at each and every entity would definitely look different. So the controls that you see listed on the left is controls that one would normally find, or those kind of controls that one would expect in a larger entity. So it's very important that you read through these controls to determine if the controls are actually applicable to your entity or not. For illustrative purposes, I have completed a few of these cells just to show you how to complete it more effectively. So for instance, under the monitoring controls, here are two controls which I said it does exist. There is some information on what the controls consist of and the sources from where we found the information or the understanding of these controls. Walkthrough tests are required for all controls that relates to significant risks or journal entries, or for any controls that the auditor wants to test controls. However, it can also be used in this working paper to obtain a better understanding of the actual control and is also regarded as a risk assessment procedure. Please indicate in this column whether you want to do a walkthrough test. For these first two controls, I've indicated that it is not required. Yes, for instance, a control that I said I do want to do a walkthrough test just because I really want to understand better how it works, perhaps a new control that has been put in place. You can indicate then, after you've documented the walkthrough test, is the control designed adequately and is it appropriately implemented? The white cell will then automatically show you that you will be able to do test of controls should you want to. Please note, it doesn't mean that you will do test of controls. Let's, for instance, just change this here to say that a control wasn't appropriately implemented. Automatically, your white cell will become a no, and then you are required to put in a reference to where this control weakness has been communicated to management. The rest of the columns provide you the opportunity to document a specific financial statement level risk, should there be one. So let's say, for instance, we decided that we did identify the risk and we documented here. The next question is it a risk of material misstatement? Now, sometimes it is just a control weakness and not necessarily a risk of material misstatement, but for illustrative purposes, let's say yes. Automatically, you will have to then complete the yellow cells. As we are dealing with financial statement level risks, you are required to select one of the 5 overall responses that's available to us in ISA315, and here you will have to document how you are going to implement this specific response. I'm just going to put some information in there, and then where that response is going to be implemented in the audit. Now we know we assign responsibility in 1705, and you can also document a management response. There will be some controls that is not applicable. For instance, if I've got an owner-managed entity and my IT environment is not that complex, all the questions regarding a complex IT environment would be not applicable. Now, for illustrative purposes, let's go to the bottom of the working paper. You will see here Action 4 gives you the opportunity to document some other entity level controls, which was, for instance, not represented at the top. Action 5 is a very important step on this working paper. You will see it is where you document your overall conclusion about the entity's internal control environment on the financial statement level. I would suggest that if you attempt this working paper for the first time, before you even start on the documentation of Action 1 to 4, that you come to Action 5 and read through these 6 evaluations so that you know what you are working towards. Let's quickly read through them. So, number 1, has management, with the oversight of those charged with governance, created and maintained a culture of honesty and ethical behavior? Now keep in mind, if you are auditing a small entity or a less complex entity, there might not be others charged with governance apart from the owner. The next evaluation. Does the control environment provide an appropriate foundation for the other components of the entity system of internal control, considering the nature and complexity of the entity? Third one, the control deficiencies identified in the control environment do not undermine the other components of the entity's system of internal control. Is the entity's risk assessment process appropriate to the entity's circumstances, considering the nature and complexity of the entity? Number 5, did the auditor identify risks of material misstatement that management failed to identify? And lastly, is the entity's process of monitoring the system of internal controls appropriate to the entity's circumstances, considering the nature and complexity of the entity? In the yellow block, based on the 6 conclusions, you need to determine if the overall control environment is effective or ineffective. In this instance, I'm going to say effective. It's very important that you document it, as this effective will pull through to 1605, the RAC summary, where you will determine if you want to do test of controls or not. And if entity level controls are in place, it would provide a foundation for doing test of controls, and there you can document your reasons of why you say that it is effective. Then lastly, remember on this working paper, when you identified risks on top, you were supposed to document financial statement level risks. On the odd chance that you identified some assertion level risks, you can document them here at the bottom, indicating if it's a business risk or a fraud risk. Working Paper 1245 IT Controls consists out of two separate sheets. The first would be the assessment of the general IT controls, and then 1245.01 would be where we identify application systems applicable to this audit. If we look at the general IT controls, the purpose of this working paper is to document the key elements of your understanding of the controls as it exists in the entity that you are auditing. Also, the information sources from which this understanding was obtained, and then the risk assessment procedures performed to identify risks on the financial statement level. Now, action 2, 3, and 4 is exactly the same as 12.40 that we've already discussed, with the only difference that here you will be assessing general IT controls instead of entity level controls. For that reason, I want to move on to action 5, which is the overall conclusion regarding the entity's general IT controls. I just quickly want to read the conclusion for you again. Does the entity's information system and communication appropriately support the preparation of the entity's financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework? You will then have to indicate yes or no, depending on what you found. Then lastly, on action 5 is the overall conclusion on effectiveness of the general IT controls. Very important that you do document this conclusion, as this conclusion will pull through to working papers 1605 further in the audit approach. Then the last action step is action 6, where we provide some space where you can document risks at the assertion level, should you have identified any during your assessment actions 1, 2, and 3. And then lastly, at the bottom, we provide you some examples of risks arising from the use of IT, and we indicated whether they are business and fraud risks, and you're welcome to read through them. 1245.02 deals with IT application systems. In action 7, you will have to indicate all the application systems used in the preparation of the financial statements. The working paper will then automatically indicate whether these systems are complex or non-complex systems by evaluating your answers in action 7. As a lot of the smaller entities mainly use Pastel as their only application system, we have taken the liberty to pre-populate the first column with Pastel, and our assessment, you will however still have to indicate whether Pastel is applicable at your entity. What you'll have to do then is to reassess each and every one of these questions to make sure that they accurately reflects the situation at your entity. You will then see here at the bottom the application systems are listed, and it's telling you in this instance that Pastel application is not a complex system and is therefore likely not subject to risk arising from IT. It further tells you, because it's not a complex system, that an IT specialist would not be required when you do the testing of the design and implementation or operating effectiveness of these IT controls. Action 8 allows you to indicate for each of the application systems identified in Action 7 which of the financial statement components are being dealt with in that system. You'll see that there's a question, do you intend to test controls? Now at this point in time, we are saying no, and then you can indicate which components is being dealt with Pastel. I've indicated all my components, which will probably be the case for a small entity. Now, just to let you know what is happening with the information from this working paper, we will just now look at the system notes, and there you will see that for each cycle, here at the bottom where we've identified that Pastel is applicable, Pastel will pull through to the system notes as well as the conclusion on whether it is a complex system and whether an IT specialist would be needed when you do the walkthrough test or if you want to test operating effectiveness. The last working paper we're going to look at today is the system notes in section 13. Please just remember that before you start documenting any information on the system notes, that you indicate which system notes are not applicable, and you can use 1020 to assist you with that determination. Now, the purpose of this working paper is to obtain an understanding of the entity's assertion level controls per cycle. You will have to document the flow of the transactions through the entity's information system, whether it is manual or an IT system. It will deal with the initiation of the transaction, supporting documents available, the recording of the transaction in the accounting records, how it's processed, if there's any calculations, how corrections are made, how the information is then incorporated in the general ledger, and at the end of the day reported in the financial statements or disclosure items. Also part of the system notes is the evaluation of the design and implementation or walkthrough tests. Please keep in mind that walkthrough tests are not required for each and every control. ISA315 only requires you to do a walkthrough test for controls that address significant risks, controls over journal entries, controls for which the auditor planned to test operating effectiveness, or other controls that the auditor consider that is appropriate to identify risks of material misstatement. Now, we do realize that the system notes can be a quite involved document to complete, so I'm going to show you the minimum that is required on this document. Firstly, the laws and regulations applicable to this cycle or component still needs to be documented, as well as the entity's internal policies and procedures that governs the specific components, and in this instance it would be trade and other receivables as well as revenue. The part about the journals is also very important. You need to document the nature of the standard journals as well as the nature of the non-standard journals. What kind of year-end journals or non-standard journals are processed for these two components. Then in Action 2, you'll see, as previously indicated, Pastel is applicable to both of these components, and it's indicated that you do not need an IT specialist when you want to do the verification. Now, Step 3 has been built in, especially for smaller entities. So it's asking us, do you want to use another existing system description instead of documenting the understanding of the system and controls in Action 4 to 7 below? Should you indicate yes, it will give you the components for the specific system notes, and you can put in a reference to your existing system description where you have already documented the flow and your understanding of the system description. What is, however, very important is that all the controls for which you would like to do a walkthrough, and a walkthrough would be applicable in those 4 instances as I've already said. So it would be for controls relating to significant risk, controls where the auditor planned to test the operating effectiveness, and controls over journals. Should any of those controls in your existing system exist, you will have to document those controls, only those controls, here at the bottom under the specific control activity. Indicate the component to which it relates to, so in this instance it would be either revenue or receivables. Document the assertion that is applicable to the specific control. Indicate whether it's manual or IT. The related applications, the frequency of the control, whether it's direct or indirect, the responsible person, and here you can document the walkthrough. Please remember, for a walkthrough test, you need to document it in sufficient detail that somebody else will be able to re-perform that procedure and get to the same conclusion. Then again, the design and implementation of the control, whether it's adequate, and should it not be adequate, you can decide if there is a risk and whether it is a business or a fraud risk. That will then pull through to 1505 for assessment. Action 8 should only be completed when there is no control that addresses the significant risks from the risk register. If you have a case where there was a significant risk and there was no controls, so you didn't do a walkthrough for it, you can indicate yes, document the significant risk below, and make sure that it has been communicated to management. Then lastly, action 9, which is the summary per component of the effectiveness of the controls. So if we go, for instance, for revenue, you will see that it automatically brings through your IT general control as well as your entity level control conclusions, where we said it was effective, and the application system, where it's indicated that it is not complex and not subject to risk arising from the use of IT. Now, based on those three conclusions, you need to determine whether the control environment and the IT application controls overall is effective or ineffective. At the bottom, you will see that the relevant assertions for revenue are listed. In this white blocks, for each of the assertions, there will be a conclusion based on the walkthrough test done on top. Now you can see in this instance we say no controls were identified because I didn't document any controls and did a walkthrough. But should you have done that, it will indicate how many controls there are, how many of those controls are effective, or how many are not effective. So based on what you see here in the white, as well as on the conclusions on top, you need to re-evaluate the effectiveness of the controls. So taking all of that into account, applying your professional judgment, you need to say, for completeness, are the controls effective or ineffective? In this instance, I'm going to say ineffective because I didn't identify any assertion level controls that I want to rely on. The impact of this would be that on 1605, when you evaluate and assess the risk of material misstatement for revenue, Draftworx will conclude and recommend that you do not do test of controls due to the fact that you have concluded here that the controls for the assertions are ineffective. I hope that this discussion will assist you in the completion of these 3 working papers. Please note that all the blue cells does not have to be completed, but it relies on your professional judgment. Remember, each and every entity's control environment is different. You will have to apply your professional judgment to the extent of documentation. Please read through the standard and the application guidance. Also, the working papers have some guidance to assist you. And if you have some suggestions or need clarity, please call us. We are always there and we'd love to listen to your suggestions. Thank you very much.